My wife looked at me and said, "Do you know I don't need you for anything at all?" I didn't answer. I grabbed my coat and left. The next day, I did something so simple she couldn't believe it. She called 411 times. I didn't answer. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Rodrigo Fuentes Valverde. I'm 53 years old. I've worked as a senior accounting auditor in a private company in Valladolid for 28 years. I've spent almost 3 decades checking other people's numbers, their accounts, their balances, their inconsistencies, with a precision my colleagues have described at different times as meticulous, obsessive, and on some occasions frankly uncomfortable. I didn't take it as an insult. I've never understood it as anything other than a compliment. I came from a family without resources. My father worked 30 years in a textile factory and died without having left Castilla more than 4 times in his life. My mother sewed other people's clothes in the afternoons to make ends meet. When I was a boy, there was nothing to spare in that house. Not money, not space, not unnecessary conversations. What we did have was an unspoken rule that no one ever said out loud, but that we all understood from a young age. He who works stays, he who doesn't contribute disappears. It wasn't cruelty, it was the only philosophy a family like ours could afford. I was the first in my family to go to college. I studied economics in Valladolid with a partial scholarship that I supplemented by tutoring math on weekends. I finished my degree without owing anything to anyone and with absolute clarity about what I wanted. Stability. Not fortune, not luxuries, not public recognition. Stability, a solid job, an orderly life, a family that wouldn't have to suffer what I suffered as a child, watching my mother count coins on the kitchen table before going to the market. I met Veronica Aguirre Palomar at an alumni dinner when we were both 29. She was a language teacher at a public high school, smart, self-confident, with a way of laughing that filled any room before she even finished entering it. I fell in love that same night, though it took me 4 months to admit it to myself, because I've always been slow to admit the things I care about too much. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the Valladolid City Hall with 50 people with no live band or 3-hour banquet. We both wanted something simple, or so I thought for a long time. The first years were good, honestly good, without idealizations. Veronica kept teaching. I moved up slowly, but steadily in the company. And although money was tight, we had enough to live without anxiety. We shared our mornings drinking coffee in the kitchen before each going our own way. It was a small routine with no apparent importance, but it was ours. I'd get home first, she'd arrive half an hour later, and we'd have dinner talking about how our day went. Nothing extraordinary, nothing I imagined at that moment I'd miss someday. When Marcos was born, Veronica decided to quit teaching. I didn't ask her to, I never would have done it, but she reasoned her salary barely covered the cost of daycare, and she preferred to be with the boy for his first years. It seemed logical to me. It even seemed like an act of love toward our son. I kept working. My income grew as I moved up in the company, and the silent agreement was established without either of us saying it out loud. I provided, she managed the house, a division of roles so common it was almost invisible, so invisible neither of us stopped to examine it for years. What I did see or thought I saw for a long time was a functioning family. Marcos grew up in a spacious apartment in downtown Valladolid. He had his books, his clothes, his activities. When he finished high school and told me he wanted to study business administration in Madrid, I didn't hesitate for a second. I paid his tuition, rented him an apartment in the Argels neighborhood, transferred him a fixed monthly allowance so he wouldn't have to worry about anything while studying. He was 21 years old. He was my son, and I'd promised myself since I was a child, that my family wouldn't have to count coins on any table. That was 5 years ago. 14 months ago, the coffee disappeared from the table in the mornings. There wasn't any dramatic moment. One morning, it just wasn't there. And when I looked at Veronica with a question in my eyes, she said she'd forgotten, that she'd been in a hurry, that I could make it myself if I cared so much. I didn't answer. I went to the coffee maker, made my own, and drank it standing in the kitchen before leaving. From that day on, I made it myself every morning for 14 straight months, without saying anything, without making any comment. without turning it into an argument neither of us would have won. It might seem like a ridiculous detail, and for a long time I treated it exactly as such. But there are small things that, viewed from the right distance, aren't small at all. They're the first sign of something changing beneath the surface slowly before anyone names it. I'd spent 28 years auditing other people's accounts, precisely because I'd learned accounting errors don't explode. They accumulate first in tenths, then in hundreds, then in thousands. When the final number appears on the screen, people are always surprised. Auditors never are. But inside my own house, I made the exact mistake I criticized most in the companies I audited. I let the signs accumulate without registering them. I trusted where I should have verified. I assumed what seemed stable was because I needed it to be. That Tuesday afternoon, when I got up from the table and took the coat from the rack, I wasn't running away. I want that to be absolutely clear from the beginning. I didn't walk out that door because I had no answer. I walked out because at that moment I understood something that takes decades to fully understand. There are situations that aren't resolved by talking. They're resolved by acting. And I, who'd spent almost 30 years acting in silence inside offices and bureaus with folders and statements and numbers others preferred not to see, knew exactly what I was going to do when dawn broke. I bought the gray coat 11 years ago in a clothing store in Valladolid that no longer exists. It cost me 120 euros, which at the time was money we couldn't spare. Veronica had seen me wear it at dinners, at meetings, on unimportant Sundays, and for several months. Every time I took it from the rack, she'd make some comment that it was old-fashioned, that the lapels were from another era, that it looked borrowed from someone older than me. The last time she said it was 3 weeks before that Tuesday, while I was looking for my keys in the hallway drawer. "Rodrigo, please, throw it away once and for all. It's as old as you are." I put on anyway. I kept putting it on. That night, I walked for 40 minutes through downtown Valladolid with no specific destination. The October air was cold and dry, the kind of cold that clears your head better than any long conversation. I walked past the office where I work, past the bank where we've had our joint account for 24 years, past the bar where my father used to drink coffee on Sundays when I was 8 and which is now a cell phone store. I walked without thinking about anything other than what I was going to do at 8:30 the next morning. I got home at 10:15. The bedroom lights were off. I lay down on the living room couch without making a sound, with my coat folded over the backrest, and I stayed awake until past 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling in the dark. There was no anger. That's what surprised me the most about myself at that moment. There was no anger. There was no crying. There wasn't that knot in the chest you expect to find when something breaks after 24 years. There was something more like clarity, the same cold and precise clarity I feel when I open an accounting balance sheet full of irregularities, and I understand in the first 5 minutes of reading exactly where the problem is and what's the only way to solve it. Veronica thought I'd left without an answer, that I'd swallowed the humiliation just like I'd swallowed so many other things in the last few months in silence, without making a sound, like men who don't want conflicts do. She was wrong. I hadn't left without an answer. I'd left to prepare it. There was a time when I'd get home and the apartment smelled of coffee and something cooking slowly on the stove. And Veronica was in the kitchen with her apron on listening to the radio. And just that and nothing more was enough for the day to stop feeling heavy the moment I walked through the door. I didn't value it as I should have valued it. That's the most uncomfortable truth I can say about myself, and I prefer to say it at the beginning rather than hide it at the end, as if it were a surprise. To understand what happened that Tuesday in October, you first have to understand what existed before. Not the tidy version you tell at family dinners, but the real version, with its good years and its years when you worked too hard and got home late and fell asleep before you'd finished apologizing. That version is also part of this story. I grew up in a 70-square-meter apartment in the delicious neighborhood in Valladolid with my parents and my sister Isabel, 3 years younger than me. My father, Emilio Fuentes Carrasco, was a precision turner in a metallurgical factory on the outskirts of the city. He'd leave the house at 6:15 in the morning and come back with dirty hands at 6:15 in the evening with a punctuality that seemed mechanical. My mother, Consuelo Valverde, Ortega sewed hymns and clothing alterations for the neighbors in the block, working at the dining room table after dinner, under an articulated arm lamp that squeaked every time she moved it. No one in that house talked about money directly. We talked about what we had and what we didn't have, which is a different and more honest way of saying the same thing. I studied well from the beginning, not out of calling, but out of necessity. I understood very early on that grades were the only currency I could generate without depending on anyone, and I worked for them with the same discipline my father worked metal. When I finished high school with grades to choose a major, my parents sat down with me one night in the kitchen, and my father said with a seriousness that left no room for interpretations, "Whatever you study, it better be useful for something." I chose economics. He didn't know very well what that meant, but he nodded. It was enough. College was 4 years of scholarships, tutoring on Saturday mornings, and few hours of sleep. I'm not complaining about that. It was exactly the kind of effort you make when you know there's no safety net underneath. I finished my degree in '92, right in the middle of an economic crisis, when getting a job with a freshly printed diploma was an exercise in patience that tested even the most steadfast. I sent my resume to 43 companies in 6 months. For call me back, only one hired me. I joined the company as an administrative assistant, checking invoices and balancing accounting entries in columns printed on continuous paper before computers took over every desk in the office. I remember the day the first computer equipment arrived in the department. A huge beige monitor with a keyboard that sounded like hail when typing. My boss at the time, a man in his 50s who'd been doing everything by hand for 20 years, looked at it for a long moment and said he didn't understand why that machine was needed if the numbers were still the same. I learned to use it in 2 weeks and spent the next 6 months teaching him. From that moment on, they let me work with some autonomy, which in an accounting firm is the most valuable form of recognition there is. I kept moving up slowly, but never going backwards. A very different ladder from some colleagues who went up fast and came down just as quickly. I preferred a steady pace. I internally documented every promotion as if it were an audit of my own career. Where did I fail? Where did I improve? What could I do better next time? It was a method my colleagues found excessive. To me, it seemed the reasonable minimum. When I met Veronica at that alumni dinner, I was 29 and had a modest but stable salary, a used car that started fine when it wasn't too cold, and the certainty that the worst of the economic uncertainty was already behind me. She taught Spanish literature at a public high school on the outskirts of the city and talked about her students with a mix of exasperation and affection that was completely genuine. She wasn't trying to impress anyone at that dinner. That's exactly what impressed me. We dated for almost 2 years before getting married. Dinners in restaurants that weren't expensive, but weren't cheap either. Weekends in Salamanca or Segovia when our schedules allowed it. Sunday mornings reading on the couch with the balcony open when the weather was nice. Veronica had a way of being quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. I could spend hours reading next to her without feeling the need to fill the space with conversation. And that for someone like me, who spent the whole day surrounded by meetings and numbers and phones that wouldn't stop, was a rest I didn't know I needed until I had it. We got married in June of 1996. Civil ceremony, 50 people, a meal in a downtown restaurant with no overflowing flowers or endless speeches. We signed a certificate, ate well, and at 8 in the evening we were in the car on our way to Asturias, where we spent 10 days in a country house we'd booked 6 months in advance because it was what we could afford and we didn't want to give up the trip. Veronica spent the 10 days reading in a wooden chair facing the sea with her hair tied up and her feet bare. I remember that with a clarity that's almost uncomfortable to me now. The first 5 years of marriage went by with a normalcy that wasn't mediocrity, but solidity. 2 people who decided to build something together and were doing it with some coherence. Veronica kept teaching. I kept moving up in the company. We saved what we could and spent wisely. We didn't travel first class or eat out every weekend, but we weren't counting coins either. It was exactly the kind of stability I'd chased since I was 16. And when I had it, I recognized it for what it was. Marcos was born in the year 2000, in March, on a Tuesday at 4 in the morning, after a night I won't forget as long as I live. When a nurse put him in my arms in that hospital hallway, with his eyes closed and his fists clenched as if he were already getting ready for something, I felt something I have no better words to describe than this. The exact weight of what it means to be responsible for someone who still doesn't know you exist. I promised myself right then, in silence and without witnesses, that boy was never going to grow up with the same sense of scarcity I carried for years, that he was going to have everything I didn't have, that his starting point was going to be different from mine. I kept that promise, and for a long time, I believed that was enough. Veronica quit teaching when Marcos turned 1. The decision was hers, reason out, and I backed her without hesitation. She told me a teacher's salary barely covered daycare expenses, that she'd prefer to be with the boy the first few years, that she'd see later on. I nodded. I took on the full financial burden. Without realizing at that moment, we were signing a second silent agreement, much more important than the first. Without properly reading all the clauses, she'd leave her career, I'd work more, and neither of us would ever talk about it with the honesty it deserved. The years with little Marcos were in their own way the best I spent in that house. I get home on Friday afternoons, and the boy would run toward the door before I finished taking out my key. Veronica had cooked something, the table was set, and during those hours the apartment had an emotional temperature that's hard to describe without sounding cliché. It was a home, not the word, but the real thing, the place you want to come back to. I work a lot during those years. Too much, if I'm completely honest. There were of Marcos's birthdays I arrived late to because I had an audit that couldn't be postponed. There were weekends when I sat next to my son on the couch, and while he told me something about school, I was still thinking about a balance sheet that wasn't adding up. There were conversations with Veronica I half started and didn't finish because my work phone interrupted at the worst possible moment, and later I never picked up the thread again. I didn't do it out of indifference. I did it because I believed, with a conviction that over time turned out to be one of my most costly mistakes, that the way to love a family well was to guarantee they lacked nothing material, that the rest went without saying. It didn't go without saying. Marcos turned 18 on a Saturday in March. We organized a small dinner at home with his grandparents and 3 of his high school friends. Veronica made the rice pudding he liked since he was a kid. I gave him a wristwatch I'd seen him look at in a shop window 3 weeks before without saying anything, convinced he hadn't noticed. He noticed, and when he opened the box and looked at me, it was one of the last times I saw on his face that clean, layerless expression kids have when they haven't yet learned to hide what they feel in front of their father. I keep that because it's the last thing of that kind I have. When Marcos told me he wanted to study in Madrid, I arranged everything in 2 weeks. I visited 3 apartments, chose the one that seemed safest and best located, signed the lease, put down a 2-month deposit, and set up a fixed monthly transfer that covered rent, books, food, and a reasonable margin for unforeseen events. Marcos left in September with his suitcases and with the certainty that he wouldn't have to worry about anything other than studying. The morning we took him to the train station, Veronica cried on the platform. I put my hand on Marcos's shoulder and told him to call when he got there. He nodded. The train pulled away. Veronica kept looking at the empty platform longer than necessary. The apartment got very quiet that afternoon. We had dinner, just the 2 of us with the TV on in the background, so the silence wouldn't feel so heavy. Veronica spoke little. I spoke less. We both pretended, with the usual politeness of long marriages, that it was just the normal adaptation to the empty nest and not the first symptom of something that had been waiting a long time for the chance to surface. That night, before turning off the light, Veronica turned to me and said in a low voice, "I hope everything we've sacrificed is worth it." I didn't quite understand what she meant. I didn't ask, I should have asked. The contempt didn't come all at once. That's the first thing you have to understand for the rest to make sense. There wasn't a morning when Veronica woke up being a different person, nor a specific date on the calendar separating the before from the after with a clear line. What there was something much harder to name, and precisely for that reason much harder to fight. A slow, constant erosion, almost imperceptible at first, like those cracks that appear on the walls of old buildings, and that engineers call differential settlement, the ground giving way unevenly under a structure it thought was solid. It started, if I had to point out a starting point, approximately 18 months before that Tuesday in October, although I admit that setting dates to emotional deteriorations is always an approximate exercise. Deteriorations don't warn you. They settle in without you giving them permission. The first gestures were so small, I convinced myself I was misinterpreting them. A tone that changed when I asked her something in the kitchen, not abrupt, not rude, but slightly elevated, like someone answering a question they've already answered too many times. A gaze that looked away when I entered a room, not with indifference, but with something more active, more deliberate. The difference between not seeing you and choosing not to look at you is subtle, but it exists. I who'd spent decades training my eye to detect anomalies in columns of numbers, took longer than I should have to recognize it in my own home. Then came the comments, always calibrated, never direct enough to justify a serious conversation, but precise enough to leave a mark. At a dinner with the Morales, a neighbor couple from the fourth floor with whom we shared a cordial relationship for years, Veronica interrupted something I was telling about an audit case to say with a smile that the rest of the table interpreted as a joke. Rodrigo's been checking other people's numbers for 30 years, and he's never learned to read his own. Everyone laughed. Me too, because it was what I was supposed to do. But the phrase stayed floating over the table after the conversation moved on to another topic. And I picked it up in silence and kept it where I keep things I don't know what they mean yet. There was more. During a phone call I made from the living room while Veronica was in the bedroom with the door ajar, I heard, without trying to, how she was telling her sister something with a tone I didn't recognize as her usual one. I couldn't hear the words clearly, just the rhythm of someone complaining about something that's been building up for a long time. When she finished the call and came out into the hallway, she looked at me with the naturalness of someone who hasn't said anything relevant and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I didn't ask. I went back to doing what I'd learned to do in that house, moved forward as if nothing had interrupted the thread. But what really changed the nature of everything, what turned the uneasiness into something with a name and an address, was Marcos. During the first months of that deterioration, my son was a neutral factor in the equation. He'd come to Vito lead 1 or 2 weekends a month. The three of us would have dinner, we'd talk about his work. He joined a small consulting firm in Madrid after graduating, and the dynamics at that table were the same as always. Veronica and Marcos talked with a mother and son's natural fluency and complicity. And I participated from the sidelines with the somewhat clumsy comfort of a father who's never known very well how to insert himself into that particular frequency. I always blamed it on character. There are fathers who get along with their children through demonstrated affection, easy hugs, and open conversation. I wasn't that type of father. I was the other type, the one who shows affection by paying tuition and rent and punctual transfers. Convinced love can also be expressed in the format of fulfilled responsibility. What began to happen gradually was that Marcos stopped being neutral. The first episode one consciously registered was a Saturday lunch, about 12 months before the Tuesday. The three of us were at the table. I'd said something about a building HOA matter, something completely irrelevant, a problem with the boiler. And Veronica answered with that tone I already knew, slightly condescending, as if the story were less interesting than I thought. What was different that time was that Marcos looked up from his plate, looked at his mother and laughed. Not a burst of laughter, nothing scandalous, a small, almost private laugh, like the one two people share when they have an inside joke the third person at the table hasn't understood yet. I didn't say anything. I finished lunch, but I noted it down. I have the habit. For so many years now, I don't remember exactly when it started, of writing by hand in a black cover notebook I keep in my nightstand drawer. Not a diary, not in the literary sense of the word, more like a log. Dates, loose phrases, figures I want to remember, observations that don't yet have a category, but something in me decides deserve to be preserved. It's the same impulse that makes me make margin notes on accounting reports, the conviction that there are details that seem minor until they stop being so. That laugh from Marcos went into the notebook that same Saturday afternoon with a date and a brief description. From then on, I started paying a different kind of attention. What I found wasn't what I expected to find. I expected, I think, to discover I'd been wrong, that I was building a pattern where there was only random noise, that the laugh had been a coincidence with no more weight than what I'd given it. But that wasn't what I found. What I found was that the pattern existed, that it had consistency, and that it had been unfolding in front of me for months with a naturalness that was only possible if it had been rehearsed for a long enough time. Marco started making his own comments, not always, not in every get-together, but with a frequency that grew steadily over the following months, comments about my way of dressing, that it was outdated, that he'd seen the gray coat before in photos from the 80s. Or about my political opinions, which he labeled conservative with a tone that didn't allow for debate, or about my way of working, which according to him was that of someone who hadn't evolved with the times. None of those observations would have been serious on its own. Adult children have their own worldviews, and they don't have to match their parents. That's not betrayal, it's growth. What was different was the setting in which those comments occurred. Always in front of Veronica, always with that moment when Marcos glanced at his mother out of the corner of his eye after saying it. As if looking for confirmation, as if waiting for the small sign of approval indicating he'd hit the right tone, and Veronica always gave it a smile, a nod of the head, sometimes a closing phrase that ended the comment with more weight than Marcos alone would have achieved. They'd been acting for months as if I were a supporting character in a play whose plot I didn't know. The most disturbing thing wasn't the content of what they said, it was the fluency with which they did it, the comfort. Two people who've practiced something long enough acquire a natural cadence when executing it, an unhesitating rhythm that's impossible to fake. What I observed at that table wasn't improvised. It was something that had been filmed somewhere else without my presence, and that was performed in front of me with the confidence of those who know the audience won't understand what they're watching. The episode that finally defined the map for me happened on a Thursday night, about 3 weeks before the Tuesday in October. Marcos called my cell phone from Madrid. It was late, past 9, and I was reviewing a report in the study. The call was brief. He wanted to know if I could advance him the monthly transfer by a few days because he had an unforeseen expense. I advanced it without asking too much, as I always did. Before hanging up, there was a silence of 2 or 3 seconds, and then Marcos said something that had nothing to do with anything we talked about in that call or any previous one. "Dad, you've already done your part." He said it with a kind, almost affectionate tone, as if it were a recognition, as if he were telling me I could rest, that the effort had been worth it, that what had to be done was already done. If I'd heard it in another context, in another stage of life, I would have taken it as exactly that, a gesture of adult gratitude, clumsy, sincere, from a son who starts to see his father as something more than an authority figure. But it wasn't another context, it was that one. I hung up. I stared at the phone on the study desk for a moment. Then I opened the drawer, took out the black cover notebook, and wrote down the exact phrase with the time and date. I didn't know right then what it meant. I still didn't have enough pieces to put the whole picture together, but there was something in that phrase, in the way it had been said, in the moment he'd chosen to say it, in that already preceding it, as if there were a line in time that had just been crossed, that gave me a discomfort that didn't go away when I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. 3 weeks went by. During that time, I tried with the kind of uncomfortable honesty that isn't shown, but practiced in silence, to ask myself if I was building something that didn't exist, if exhaustion or age or some form of susceptibility I hadn't recognized in myself before were making me read intentions where there was simply distance and weariness. I seriously considered it. It's the least you owe yourself before acting, to seriously consider the possibility of being wrong. But auditors have a rule you learn in your early career years and never forget. When a pattern appears consistently for a long enough time, it stops being a statistical anomaly. It becomes evidence. And what I've been recording for months in that notebook with dates, with phrases, with context, had the consistency of evidence, not the profile of a perception error. The Tuesday in October arrived without announcing itself in any special way. It was a normal workday, morning meetings and afternoon report reviews. The hour-and-a-quarter car ride back home with the radio tuned to a station playing the same 4 songs on rotation. I parked in the garage, went up in the elevator, opened the apartment door with a key I'd had on the same keychain for 11 years. The smell of lentils, the table set for 3, Veronica in the kitchen. Marcos, already sitting with his phone in his hand. I sat down, poured water in my glass, and then Veronica turned from the other end of the table with her arms crossed and that calmness I've already described, and that was much worse than anger. And she uttered the phrase, "What happened next you already know. What you still don't know is what happened that same night, long after the bedroom lights went out. While I was lying on the couch with a gray coat folded over the backrest and the dark ceiling above, processing not the humiliation, I'd already processed the humiliation out on the street walking in the cold October air, but something far more concrete and far more useful. The exact plan I was going to execute at 8:30 the next morning, step by step, with the same methodology I'd apply to any audit I had in front of me. Veronica had spent 18 months building something. I'd spent 3 weeks suspecting it. From Wednesday morning on, I was going to know it for sure. Wednesday dawned with fog. In Valladolid in October, fog isn't a surprise, but a condition, a usual texture of the air that those born here learn to ignore from childhood. But I remember that morning with photographic precision. The deserted street at 8:20, the streetlights still on. Even though it was already daytime, the cold car because I hadn't waited for the engine to warm up. I left the house before Veronica woke up. It wasn't a dramatic gesture or a getaway. It was an operational decision. What I had to do required time, and I wanted it resolved before the workday began. My bank's main office in Valladolid opened at 8:30. I arrived at 8:23 and waited in the car with the engine off, staring at the glass door, until I saw the inside lights turn on and an employee flip the close sign. I walked in second. The receptionist recognized me. I've been a client of the same bank at the same branch for over 20 years, and there's a discreet familiarity built over the years without anyone explicitly seeking it. He greeted me by name. I greeted him back and asked to speak with the account manager. Alfredo Sanz Herrero helped me, a man of about 45 with whom I'd handled several business matters over time. I explained to him, without going into more detail than strictly necessary, that I wanted to split the joint account into 2 individual accounts, cancel the shared credit card effective immediately, and suspend all automatic transfers linked to that account. Alfredo looked at me for a moment with the restrained expression of someone who understands he's facing a personal situation without knowing exactly how much to ask. He didn't ask anything. He took out the corresponding forms, and we started working. The whole process took 42 minutes. I signed what had to be signed. I verified that every operation was correctly recorded, and before getting up from the chair, I asked Alfredo to print the statements for the last 36 months of the joint account. He looked at me with slight surprise he hid well. 36 months of statements represented a considerable volume of pages. I told him I needed them for an annual tax return matter I preferred to review ahead of time. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that fits smoothly in a bank environment where no one questions someone wanting to check their own numbers. I left at 9:16 with a paper folder under my arm and arrived at the office with a 4-minute margin before my first meeting of the day. I worked until 2 with the folder inside my briefcase without opening it. It wasn't the time or the place. Audits require concentration and privacy, and I had enough professional discipline not to mix times. I did what I had to do during the morning with the same attention as always, and only when the last coworker left for lunch and the office went quiet, I opened my briefcase, took out the folder, and placed it on the desk. I poured myself a glass of water from the hallway dispenser. I went back to my chair and started reading. I have to explain something before continuing, because otherwise what I'm going to tell won't make sense. For 24 years, I never checked the household accounts with a professional eye. Not because I didn't know how to do it. It was literally my job, but because I'd established from the beginning of the marriage a separation between work and personal life, which at the time seemed reasonable to me and over time became a blind spot. Veronica managed the household expenses. I transferred the money we agreed on at the beginning of every month and assumed everything was working fine because there was never any visible sign it wasn't. It was the same trust a doctor can have in their own body. Training doesn't eliminate proximity, and proximity eliminates objectivity. What I started seeing on those pages wasn't immediately obvious. You have to understand how financial fraud works to understand why I didn't see it before. Frauds that last are those designed not to be seen, not those that challenge control, but those that blend in with the usual noise of the data. The ones using small amounts, irregular dates, variable frequencies, the ones that looked at one by one, seem like everyday expenses with no particularity, the ones that only reveal their nature when someone lines them all up in a sequence and applies the right eye. I had the right eye. What had been missing up to that moment was the need to use it. The first 12 pages showed exactly what was expected. Gas bills, insurance, HOA fees, credit card, phone transfers, some streaming platform charges, everything recognizable, everything in line with what I knew about the household expenses. I turned pages quickly, marking with a pencil the items I recognized, creating the baseline for the ordinary to be able to identify, by contrast, what wasn't. It appeared for the first time in the month of the statements in a €640 transfer with the reference miscellaneous expenses. It wasn't an amount that stood out on its own. €640 is the kind of charge you easily attribute to a home repair, to buying a small appliance, to any of the unforeseen events that happen in a house with some regularity. I wrote it down. I kept going. 3 pages later, another transfer, €580, same reference, miscellaneous expenses. Destination account different from the usual household suppliers. I wrote it down too. I found a third one before finishing lunch. €490, same destination account as the second transfer. I got up, went for another glass of water, and came back with the specific feeling I've felt on other occasions during long audits. The feeling of being on the verge of something that doesn't yet have a complete shape, but will very soon as the data finishes lining up. It's a mix of concentration and something that isn't exactly fear, but it's cold or relative, the certainty that you're not going to like what you're about to see. I reorganized the pages chronologically and focused exclusively on the transfers to that account. I extracted them one by one, ordering them by date, writing down the amount of each one in the black cover notebook I'd taken to work that day for the first time. The pattern kept emerging number by number. 94 transfers in 27 months, none over €800, none under 290, spaced irregularly. Sometimes 2 in the same month, sometimes none for 6 weeks, with a date variation that prevented the brain from establishing a recognizable cadence, designed, ultimately, to stay below the attention threshold of someone checking the statements with the ordinary gaze of someone just looking to confirm the numbers add up at the end of the month. I added up the total 3 times, because the first time I thought I'd made a mistake, €38,400. I stared at that figure written in the notebook for a time I don't know how to quantify accurately. It wasn't a minute, nor was it 10. It was the time it takes the brain to accept a fact that contradicts a belief that's been installed for years. The belief that the person you've slept with for 24 years, who you've shared a table and a son and a mortgage and birthdays and summers and feverish nights with when Marcos was little, isn't stealing from you. There was no breakdown, there was no crying, there were none of the reactions you'd probably expect from someone who just discovers something like this. What there was a concentration that sharpened until it was almost painful, like when you turn your eyes toward an intense light source and the muscles around them tense up on their own. The more absurd the data is, the more precision verification requires. That's the first rule of any audit. It took me 20 minutes to confirm the destination account belonged to the same bank. I couldn't access the holder's data from my statements. That required other means, but the account number coding clearly indicated the entity. I had the number, I had the dates, I had the amounts. For the next step, I needed either a court order or someone inside the bank willing to confirm what I already suspected. At 4:43 in the afternoon, my phone rang for the first time. It was Veronica. I let it ring. 4 minutes later, second call. I let it ring too. At 4:47, the third one rang. At that moment, I took out the notebook, wrote down the time, and wrote next to it, first time the card was declined, because that was what was happening right then in some supermarket in Valladolid. The joint card Veronica carried in her purse had just stopped working, and she was understanding in real time that something had changed while she slept. The calls didn't stop. I wrote them all down with the exact time of each one in the same notebook, where I'd recorded Marcos's phrase and the bank statements and the comments from the last few months. For one, calls between 4:47 in the afternoon and 11:01 at night. In some intervals, there were 3 or 4 in a row, with barely a minute between them. In others, there were longer pauses, 20 minutes, half an hour, which I imagined as the time someone dedicates to trying to calm down before trying again. I didn't answer any, not because I wanted to punish her with silence, but because there was nothing to say yet. A conversation without all the information on the table wasn't a conversation. It was a negotiation where one of the two arrives without knowing what the other knows. And I wasn't willing to sit in that position. That night, when I got home past 9, the apartment was silent. Veronica was in the bedroom with the door closed. I went to the kitchen, heated up something I found in the fridge, ate standing next to the counter. From the hallway, I heard she was talking quietly to someone on the phone. I didn't try to listen. I already knew enough for that night. What I was missing was the confirmation of what I suspected about the destination account. I needed to know who that number belonged to. And the next day, when I talked to Alfredo Sands at the bank and asked him to discreetly verify the ownership of that account, arguing, I thought I detected an irregular operation, and it took him 4 minutes to return to the desk with an expression that was no longer just the polite manager's, but that of a man who understands he's facing something serious. When he told me the holder's name with a deliberately neutral voice, I suddenly understood why Marcos had said that phrase 3 weeks before. Dad, you've already done your part. The account belonged to my son. There's a difference between knowing something happened and understanding how it happened. The first is a fact. The second is an understanding. And I needed the understanding, not only because of the emotional weight of what I discovered, but for a practical reason any experienced auditor understands immediately. Acting on incomplete data is almost as dangerous as not acting. Legal errors, poorly negotiated agreements, confrontations that turn against the person initiating them, almost always have the same origin. Someone who acted before having the complete picture. I wasn't going to make that mistake. That same Thursday afternoon, after confirming with Alfredo Sands that the destination account was registered to Marcos Fuentes Aguirre, with an address in Madrid and an opening date 4 years ago, I returned to the office and closed my office door. I had the 36 months of statements on the desk, the notebook open to the page where I'd written down the transfer summary, and several hours ahead before anyone needed me for anything else. I started from the beginning, not from where I'd left off the day before, but from the first statement, the oldest. I wanted to understand not just the what, but the exact when, and above all how it had been designed to survive undetected. What I pieced together over the next few hours was, from a technical standpoint, a simple but meticulously executed scheme. The joint account received my usual monthly transfer every month, which covered ordinary household expenses and left a reasonable surplus for unforeseen events. Veronica had managed that account for years with complete autonomy, which meant transfers to Marcos's account didn't require a second signature or additional authorization, just the online access she had, and which I'd never had any reason to question. The amount had been calibrated with a precision that wasn't accidental. No transfer exceeded 800 euros, which is the informal threshold below which many banks don't generate automatic tracking alerts on personal accounts. None was below 290, which kept each transaction within a range that in isolation could be attributed to any household expense of a certain magnitude. The dates varied deliberately. Never the same day of the month twice in a row, never in regular weekly patterns with intervals ranging between 8 and 41 days. It was a signature as clear as a name. What takes me the most time in those hours isn't reconstructing the mechanism, but establishing the chronology accurately. I need to know exactly when it started, because the start date tells me something the total amount can't tell me. When was the decision made? And the decision in this type of scheme is always the most revealing piece of data. The amounts talk about how much, the dates talk about why. The first irregular transfer appears in the statements dated on a Friday in January. 27 months ago, 290 euros reference miscellaneous expenses, an amount so discreet that at another time, with another look, it would have gone unregistered. 27 months ago, Marcos had been working for about 6 months at the consulting firm in Madrid. Convinced a father who can help his son should do so unconditionally. 27 months ago, Veronica had gone about 4 months without making coffee in the mornings. The temporal coincidence between the start of the scheme and the attitude change I'd started to notice at home wasn't a coincidence. It was a sequence. Something had happened around that time that had set both things in motion simultaneously, and I needed to understand what. I spent 2 hours reviewing emails from the period in question. The ones from the account we shared for household matters, bills, school communications when Marcos was little, that kind of correspondence that piles up for years without anyone archiving or deleting it. I found something that at the time I hadn't registered as significant, an exchange between Veronica and her sister Carmen, dated 3 weeks before the first irregular transfer. Carmen Aguirre lived in Zaragoza and worked as an HR technician in a logistics company. The relationship between the two sisters was cordial, but not particularly close. They saw each other 3 or 4 times a year. They talked on the phone regularly, and that was it. The exchange in question was a short chain of messages of no more than 6 or 7 lines total. But there was a phrase in Carmen's last message that stayed before my eyes longer than necessary. Carmen had written her, "You're right. You've spent years giving everything without anyone seeing it. Something is yours by right." There was no prior context in that chain. I didn't know what Veronica had said before that message, because the previous messages of that conversation weren't in the shared account. They'd had that part of the exchange on another channel, probably on her personal phone, but Carmen's response was enough to understand the general direction of what had been discussed. Veronica had left a career to stay home. That was the root. I don't say it as an excuse. I say it as a diagnosis, which is different. Veronica had given up her teaching job when Marcos was born, and what at the time she presented as a decision made calmly had turned, over the years and in silence, into a resentment she'd never verbalized directly, but which had been fermenting beneath the surface with the constancy of things that don't get resolved because they don't get named. She believed we owed her something. She believed with the twisted logic of someone who spent too long ruminating on a grievance without venting it, that what she was taking was simply what she was owed. And Marcos knew it. That was what I couldn't shake off as I moved forward in the reconstruction. Not the complicity itself. Complicity could have explanations that a 22 or 23-year-old son maybe didn't know how to handle well when it was first presented to him. What had no reasonable explanation was the continuity, 27 months, 94 transfers. An adult son with a degree, with a job, with enough judgment to manage on his own in Madrid, who for more than 2 years received irregular transfers into his account, knowing perfectly well where that money came from and who it was being stolen from. It wasn't a momentary mistake. It was a decision maintained over time. Every month Marcos received that money and said nothing. It was a new choice. Not the same choice repeated mechanically, but an active, renewed, conscious choice. And I'd paid for that awareness for 5 years. The degree, the apartment, the allowance, the car, everything he had as an adult starting point he owed to me, and he knew it as well as I did. That's what turned the betrayal into something qualitatively different from what it would have been if Veronica had acted alone. I finished the reconstruction on Friday afternoon. I had a complete 27-month chronology in the notebook with dates, amounts, and the documented variation pattern. I had the exact start date of the scheme and its temporal correlation with the attitude change I'd started to notice at home. I had the destination account holder's name. I had the email exchange pointing to the motivation. What I was missing was something no bank statement could give me. The confirmation that Marcos wasn't simply the passive receiver of money arriving in his account without him requesting it, but an active participant in the scheme. For that I needed a different kind of evidence. On Saturday morning, I call my sister Isabel. Isabel Fuentes Valverde is 58 years old and works as an archive technician at the Valladolid Provincial Council. She's 3 years younger than me. She has an extraordinary memory for details the rest of us miss, and she's the only person in my life I've told things I wouldn't have told anyone else. Not because she's my sister, but because she's exactly the kind of person who listens before opining and who, when she opines, does so without softening what she thinks out of unnecessary delicacy. I asked to see her that same day. I didn't explain anything over the phone, just that I needed to talk to her, and it was important. We met at a downtown coffee shop at 12. I arrived with a notebook and a copy of the marked statements I'd prepared the night before. I told her everything from the beginning, in chronological order, with the same methodology I'd have presented a report to a client. The facts first, the interpretation next, the conclusions at the end. Isabel listened to me without interrupting for almost 20 minutes. When I finished, she stayed silent for a moment, looking at the marked pages I'd left on the table. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Rodrigo, I saw Marcos and Vito lead 3 weeks ago, on a Wednesday afternoon." I looked at her. Marcos had been in Vito lead on a Wednesday afternoon without telling me anything, without calling me, without coming home. 3 weeks before the Tuesday in October, while I was writing down in my notebook the phrase he'd told me on the phone, "Dad, you've already done your part." He was physically in the city on a visit no one had told me about. "Where did you see him?" I asked. Isabel hesitated for a second. "Coming out of your building, yours." It was 6:30 in the evening, more or less. I was on a drop-off, something you'd asked me for. He was coming out when I was arriving. He said hi. He told me he'd come to see his mom, that you were working. It seemed weird to me you hadn't told me, but I thought maybe it was a last-minute visit. 6:30 in the evening on a Wednesday was exactly the time I wasn't home. I'd arrived between 7:15 and 7:30, depending on traffic. Marcos had visited his mother at a time he knew for a fact I wouldn't be there. I took out the notebook and wrote down the date Isabel gave me. Then I checked the statements for that month. 4 days after that visit, a €720 transfer to Marcos's account. It wasn't the only one that month, but it was the closest in time to the visit Isabel had witnessed. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was consistent with a pattern where in-person visits and transfers kept a proximity relationship that wasn't random. Isabel asked me what I was going to do. I told her I wasn't going to do anything yet, that I needed one more thing before moving, the formal documentation of everything I had, organized in a way that was useful, not just for me, but for any legal process that might follow. And for that, I needed to talk to someone who wasn't me. I told her I was going to call a lawyer the following week. Isabel put her hand on my arm over the table with that gesture of hers that isn't condescending, but simply her way of saying she's there. "Are you okay?" I told her yes. And it was true in the strictest sense of the word. I wasn't okay in the sense that I was calm or rested or at peace with what I discovered. I was okay in the sense that I knew exactly what I had to do and I had the ability to do it. That the anger I felt was cold and orderly, not hot and destructive. That I wasn't going to make any mistakes out of haste or pain. Veronica at that moment still believed the worst thing that had happened to her was that a credit card had failed her in a supermarket. She still didn't know what was coming. And Marcos, in his Madrid apartment, the apartment whose rent I kept paying with a punctuality that now seemed almost ironic to me, didn't know it either. I put the notebook in my inside jacket pocket, picked up the pages from the table, and asked for the bill. Outside, the October Saturday had that flat and gray color that in Castilla announces winter has already decided to stay. I walked to the car with my hands in my pockets and the cold air hitting my chest directly. There was no rush. There's never a rush when you work methodically. Rushing is the privilege of those who improvise, and I'd spent 28 years being exactly the opposite. Sunday night with Burgos. I hadn't planned it in advance. I left the house past 9 with the excuse of going for cigarettes. I haven't smoked for 12 years, but it was the first thing I could think of. And when I found myself on the highway with the speedometer climbing and Vito lead staying behind amidst the city lights, I understood I wasn't coming back in a couple of hours. I needed a distance the city where I lived couldn't give me. Burgos was 120 kilometers away, far enough not to bump into anyone I knew at breakfast, close enough to be back before the absence required an explanation. I walked into the first reasonable hotel I found near downtown, asked for a single room, paid in cash, and went up with nothing more than what I had on me. My car keys, my wallet, the black cover notebook in my inside jacket pocket. The room was small, with a window facing an inner courtyard and a bedside lamp casting a yellow light on the bedspread. I sat on the edge of the bed without taking off my shoes and stayed like that for a long time, staring at the floor without thinking about anything specific. Sometimes the brain needs that empty space before what it really wants to process arrives, like when you fill a glass too fast and have to wait for the liquid to settle before you can see the real level. What came first wasn't anger or calculation or any of the mental states I'd had over the last few days. What came was a memory of Santander. It had to do with Veronica, and precisely for that reason, I let it in instead of pushing it away. It was the summer of 2004. Marcos was 4 years old. We'd rented a small house on the coast for 10 days in a town about 30 kilometers from the city with a terrace overlooking a cliff right over the sea. The nights were cool even in August, and we slept with the window open listening to the water. I remember one specific afternoon. It must have been the 5th or 6th day when Marcos fell asleep after lunch with that total abandon little kids have when the sun and the sea have exhausted them. Veronica and I sat on the terrace with 2 glasses of white wine without talking, looking at the horizon. There was nothing to resolve, nothing pending, no obligatory conversation, just the sound of the sea and that type of shared silence that requires years of shared history to build, and which when it exists is possibly the most honest form of intimacy 2 people can have. After a while, Veronica rested her bare feet on the terrace railing, turned her head toward me, and said, without any preamble, "This is enough, Rodrigo, this is enough for me." She said it with a calmness I interpreted at that moment as happiness. Now, in that hotel room in Burgos, I wondered if it hadn't also been the first glimpse of something more complicated. A woman telling her husband she didn't need more than she had, and that husband hearing it as praise when maybe it was a warning. I don't exonerate her. And for the record, what she did for 27 months has no justification that holds up to an honest analysis. And accumulated resentment, as legitimate as it might be in its origin, doesn't authorize anyone to build a systematic theft scheme behind the other's back. That isn't a response to a grievance. It's a premeditated betrayal. There's a difference, and Veronica crossed it consciously. But that night in Burgos, I forced myself to do something that's harder than it seems. Look at myself with the same coldness I'd looked at the bank statements with. And what I saw wasn't completely comfortable to me. I work too much. That's the most direct truth I can say. Not as an excuse or as an accusation toward anyone, but as a diagnosis of what I was for many years. A man who confused financial responsibility with real presence, who believed with a conviction no one had openly questioned that fulfilling the money part was fulfilling everything, who got home late, fell asleep before finishing conversations, and the next day kept working convinced the end result. The stability, the security, the paid apartment, and the covered tuition was the most solid proof of the love he knew how to give. Veronica had spent years in a house without a career, without the professional identity she'd had before getting married, without ever asking herself again what would have become of her if she'd kept teaching. And I never asked her if that weighed on her, not out of indifference, but because I assumed if she didn't name it, it was because she didn't need to name it. That was my real mistake. Not trusting, but confusing silence with compliance. That doesn't make what she did understandable, but it does force me to acknowledge the setting where that resentment grew wasn't built only by her. I got off the bed, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stood for a moment looking in the mirror. I don't like moments in front of the mirror in unknown hotels. The lighting is always the worst possible for that kind of examination, but there are conversations that can only be had without an audience, and that was one of them. What I saw was a 53-year-old man who was going to win what he had to win, but who was going to pay a price no bank statement could quantify. Because recovering the money is possible, reorganizing the assets is possible, legally protecting what's yours is possible, what isn't possible. And that night, I understood it with a clarity that hurt like only true things hurt. Is getting the time back, the Santander summers, the Sundays when Marcos was little, and I was thinking about a balance sheet that wasn't adding up. The conversations Veronica stopped starting because she'd learned she wasn't going to find me on the other side. That doesn't come back. That was lost before anyone made any wrong decisions, and acknowledging it quietly, with no audience and no applause, was the least I owed myself. I sat back on the bed, opened the notebook, and started working, because that was also the purpose of that night, not just the personal examination, but the technical preparation for what was coming. And for that I needed to think with an auditor's head, not with that of the husband who just discovers he's been fleeced for 2 years by the people he trusted the most. I spent 2 hours mentally reorganizing the map of assets we had as a marriage. The Vito-Lead apartment acquired as marital property in 1998 with a mortgage we'd finished paying off 5 years ago, an attached parking spot. An investment fund solely in my name I'd opened before the marriage, and which was therefore personal property. A savings account linked to my company, also personal, and a joint account, now split with the balance left after Wednesday's operations. What Veronica had extracted for 27 months came from the marital assets, from the money I contributed as monthly income to the marriage's common fund, which meant from a legal standpoint, she'd unilaterally disposed of common assets without the other spouse's consent. It had a precise name in the civil code and concrete consequences in the divorce process, especially regarding the liquidation of the marital property. I needed a lawyer specializing in family law who understood the patrimonial dimension of the case, not just the standard separation procedure. And I needed to have it ready before any direct confrontation, because the moment Veronica understood what I knew, the margin to act with an advantage would drastically shrink. I wrote down the name Tomas Reguera Ibanez in the notebook. I knew him from several years ago when I'd hired him to review a commercial contract for the company. Main specialty, patrimonial and family law, solid reputation, discreet, efficient. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't seek the spotlight, but results, who preferred documenting well to talking a lot, and who on the 2 previous occasions I needed him, had proven he understood his client's time is worth exactly what he charges for it. I'd send him a message Monday morning asking for an urgent appointment. It was 2:40 in the morning when I turned off the lamp and laid down on the bed without undressing, with my jacket folded over the chair and the notebook on a nightstand. The inner courtyard was completely silent. No street noise, no voices, just that dense hotel silence when the entire building is asleep. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours straight. Sometime between 4 and 5, I woke up with a feeling that wasn't exactly anxiety, but its more mature and contained form. The clear awareness that a part of me wasn't going to survive this, even if everything went exactly as I had planned. Not the financial part, not the legal part. Something harder to name, the version of the father I believed I was building for 25 years. The man who paid tuitions and rents convinced that was love put into practice. That version of myself was going to become obsolete after this story, and replacing it with something better was going to require a kind of work no audit could teach you. I got up, leaned out the courtyard window. The sky over the rooftops was turning from black to the dark blue of 6 in the morning. Burgos in silence, with the October cold creeping through the window frames. I called Isabel from my cell, knowing she wouldn't answer at that time, but needing to leave a record that I was fine, that nothing had happened, that I'd be back in Vito Lead before noon. I left her a 30-second voicemail. Then I washed my face, picked up the notebook, went downstairs to pay for the room at reception, and went out to the car. I made the drive back with the radio off. 120 kilometers in silence, with the sunrise slowly opening over the plateau, that horizontal early morning light that flattens the landscape and turns it an almost unreal clarity. I entered Vito Lead past 8. I parked in the building's garage with the same care as always. I went up in the elevator. I opened the apartment door. Veronica was in the kitchen with a coffee mug in her hands. She looked at me when I walked in. She didn't say anything for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. Then she asked with a voice pretending to be neutral, but carrying the weight of 4 days of unanswered calls. "Where are you?" I told her I needed to clear my head, that I'd driven for a while and fallen asleep in the car at some rest stop, that I was fine, that we'd talk when I was ready. She held my gaze 2 seconds longer than necessary, like someone searching the other's face for something confirming the story fits. She didn't find anything that didn't fit, because I'd spent 28 years learning to present exactly what I wanted to be seen and nothing else. I went to the bedroom, changed clothes, and went to work like any Monday. In the afternoon, Tomas Reguera Ibanez returned my message with availability for Wednesday at 5. I confirmed immediately. The door was closed, not with anger, not with haste. With the precise calmness of someone who knows what comes next has no turning back, and that after all is exactly what I needed. Tomás Reguera Ibáñez had his office on the second floor of an early last-century building on Santiago Street, a 4-minute walk from the cathedral. The facade had no flashy signs, just a discreetly oxidized bronze plaque next to the entrance with his name and specialty engraved in small letters. It was the kind of office you find when you look for it deliberately, never by chance. And that detail said a lot about the type of clientele that frequented it. I arrived on Wednesday at 5:03. The secretary let me in right away. Tomás was 51 years old, slim build, graying hair cut with a simplicity that wasn't carelessness but judgment. He wore thin-framed glasses and spoke with the verbal economy of someone who's learned that in his profession extra words cost as dearly as missing ones. He greeted me, pointed to the chair across his desk, and before I said anything, he took out a blank notepad and a pen. "Tell me," he said. I told him with the same order and methodology I'd told Isabel. The facts first, the interpretation next. I handed him the copy of the marked statements, the chronology I'd reconstructed in the notebook, the documentation of the 94 transfers with dates and amounts, and the destination account number, with the ownership confirmation Alfredo Sands had verbally provided me at the bank. Tomás didn't interrupt me at any point. He took notes with a concentration indicating he was processing every piece of data in real time, not just recording it. When I finished, he put the pen down on the pad and leaned back slightly in his chair, joining the fingers of both hands in front of his face with the gesture of someone mentally organizing what he just received. He spoke for 20 minutes. What he told me, summarized in its essential points, was this: the unilateral disposition of marital assets without the other spouse's consent is regulated in the civil code and has direct consequences on the liquidation process of the marital property. What Veronica had done for 27 months could be legally classified as misappropriation of common assets, which significantly modified the negotiating position in the divorce process. The fact that the receiving account was in Marcos's name added an extra patrimonial dimension, because the funds transferred to the son could be claimed as part of the misappropriated common estate, depending on how the circuit was documented. He told me that with the documentation I provided, I could initiate the contentious divorce process with a solid foundation, and that before any direct confrontation with Veronica, it was advisable to formalize the petition. So the procedure would be registered with a date prior to any move she could make on her own once she understood the full situation. I asked him how long it took to formalize the petition. He told me if I gave him the original documents that same week, he could have everything filed before the following Friday. We agreed on a second meeting for Thursday. I left the office at 6:15 with the same folder under my arm, but with a different weight than when I walked in. The weight of something already in motion that no longer depended solely on my will, but on a process with its own entity, with dates and records and consequences no one could stop once initiated. That same night, from the car parked outside Tomás's office, I made a transfer from my phone. A single brief operation I'd had pending for several days without executing because I wanted to do it at the right time, not before. I canceled the direct debit for Marcos's apartment rent in Madrid. I didn't warn him. I didn't send him any message. There was no prior call or explanation of any kind. The payment for the following month simply wouldn't happen, and Marcos would discover it when the apartment owner demanded the amount or when he checked his own accounts and verified the money he expected hadn't arrived. Whether it took him a day to find out or a week was irrelevant. The relevant part was the operation date recorded in the banking system with minute precision. I put my phone in my inside jacket pocket, started the engine, and drove home. The following days went by with a normalcy that would have seemed strange to any outside observer. Veronica and I shared the apartment with the distant courtesy of two people who've tacitly agreed not to open any fronts until both are ready. She hadn't mentioned the unanswered calls again or the night I'd spent away. I hadn't given any additional explanation to the one I offered her Monday morning. The cohabitation was sustained on a surface of normalcy, so deliberate it was almost perfect in its artificiality. On Thursday, I went to Tomás's office with the originals. I signed what had to be signed. He explained the procedural steps with the same verbal economy as always, without drama, without the emotional underlining a matter of this type might have tempted someone less professional to add. I appreciated that. I didn't need anyone validating what I was doing or putting a narrative frame on it. I just needed it to work. The petition was filed on Friday before noon. From that moment on, the clock was ticking in a direction no one could reverse. What I had left to decide was when and how to talk to Veronica. Not whether to talk, that wasn't optional. And besides, I didn't want her finding out about the divorce through a court notice without there having been a direct conversation first, not out of sentimental consideration, but for a practical reason. I wanted to be present when she understood it all. I wanted to see the face of someone who's believed for months they have the upper hand at the exact moment they discover they not only didn't have the upper hand, but they've been playing on a board someone else had set up. I chose Sunday. The choice of day wasn't arbitrary. On Sunday afternoons, Veronica tended to be home with no fixed plans, no scheduled visits, no chance of using a tight schedule as a shield or an excuse to cut a conversation short. On Sunday afternoons, the apartment had that specific weekend stillness, when the following week hasn't yet started pressing, and that stillness was exactly the setting I needed. No interference, no audience, no external element, giving Veronica the chance to turn what was going to be a conversation into a performance, because that was what I wanted to avoid above all else. Veronica, in the presence of other people, had always known how to manage the narrative. It was a skill I'd admired in her for years, the ability to enter any social situation and find the exact tone that made her appear a certain way in front of others. Without an audience, that mechanism didn't work. Without an audience, the person remained, not the character. On Saturday, I prepared the final folder, took the marked original statements, the complete chronology of the 94 transfers, the copy of the email between Veronica and her sister Carmen, which I'd found in the shared account, and Alfredo Sanz's written confirmation on the destination account ownership, which I'd formally requested in writing the day before arguing I needed it for an ongoing legal process. All placed in chronological order inside a gray cardboard folder with dividers with no emotional underlining in the presentation. The same format I'd used to deliver a report to a client. I also prepared something Tomas had suggested in our second meeting. A short one-page document summarizing the marital assets and classifying them between common and personal to have it available as a reference in case the conversation drifted into financial territory before I wanted to take it there. Sunday dawned cloudy. I went to buy the newspaper in the morning. I came back, drank coffee in the kitchen. Veronica was reading something in the living room. We exchanged 4 sentences about nothing in particular with the usual naturalness of those days. At noon, I cooked something simple. We ate. I cleared the plates. At 4:15 in the afternoon, when Veronica settled on the couch with the book she'd left in the morning and the house was in that Sunday silence I already knew by heart, I went to the bedroom, took the folder out of the nightstand drawer where I'd kept it the night before, and went back to the living room. I sat in the armchair across from her with the folder on my knees. Veronica looked up from her book and looked at me. There must have been something in my expression that didn't match the usual Sunday, because she left the book closed on the couch next to her, without me saying anything yet. That involuntary gesture told me that on some level she hadn't yet verbalized, and maybe hadn't recognized, she knew that moment was coming. I placed the folder on the low table between us. "We need to talk," I said, and my voice came out with the calmness of someone who's rehearsed emotional control for days. Not the speech. I hadn't written the speech. I didn't need it, but the exact temperature from which I wanted to utter every sentence. Not the temperature of anger that raises the voice and loses the arguments. Not that of the wound, which seeks the other to acknowledge the damage and almost never achieves it, but the temperature of someone who has everything they need on the table and can afford the luxury of speaking slowly. Veronica looked at me without saying anything. She waited. I opened the folder. "I'm going to show you something," I said. "And when you see it, I'm not going to need you to explain anything to me because I already understand everything." What would happen next in that room, I'd mentally reviewed from different angles over several days. I considered every possible reaction variant, every argument she could use, every exit route she might try to explore, not because I wanted to craft a response for each one, That would have been the mistake of someone confusing a confrontation with a debate. But because knowing the terrain before stepping into it is the only way not to be surprised. And Rodrigo Fuentes Valverde had spent 28 years making sure he wasn't surprised. I placed the first marked statement on the table turned toward her so she could read it easily. I pointed to the first transfer with my index finger, date, amount, destination account, and waited. Veronica took about 4 seconds to understand what she was looking at. I know because I counted them, not deliberately, but because in those kinds of moments time takes on a different texture, it becomes granular, and you perceive each second as a separate unit with its own weight. For seconds, looking at the marked statement on the table. Then she looked up at me with an expression that wasn't yet any of the ones that would come later, but something prior to all of them. The exact instant the brain recognizes the scenario it had calculated has just been replaced by a completely different one. I didn't say anything. I let silence do the work. No one in those circumstances can do better than it. This is a bank statement, she finally said. Her voice was controlled, but the control was visible, which meant it required effort. I don't understand what you want me to see. I pointed to the pencil-marked transfer, date, amount, destination account number. Do you recognize this account number? I said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the number, a fraction of a second too long before answering. I don't know whose account that is. I took the second document out of the folder and placed it over the first. It was the sheet with the complete chronology. 94 transfers sorted by date with the amount of each one and the receiving account number identical in all of them. 27 months, I said, 94 operations, 38,400 euros. The number out loud in that room had an effect I hadn't fully anticipated, although I'd imagined it. It filled the space in a way that made the rest of the furniture, the couch, the lamp, the closed book next to her seem suddenly completely irrelevant, as if the figure had reorganized the hierarchy of everything existing at that moment inside those four walls. Veronica let the air out slowly through her nose. It was the gesture of someone deciding in real time what position to adopt, what version of facts can still be sustained and which can no longer. I saw that process on her face with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable to me, because for 24 years I'd looked at that face without reading what was happening behind it. Household expenses have been high these years, she said. There are things I didn't always tell you because I didn't want to worry you with details. 38,400 euros in details, I replied. The tone was the same as always, without elevation, without marked irony, just a fact. She shifted her position on the couch, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but indicating the first line of defense had been abandoned and firmer ground was being sought. Marcos has had unforeseen expenses, the apartment, some problems I didn't want you to know about to avoid generating tension between you two. I took out the third document, Alfredo Sanz, written confirmation on the account ownership. Marcos's name clearly printed in the header. The account belongs to Marcos. I said, I've known it for 10 days and Marcos has known it for 27 months, which is exactly how long he's been receiving it. The silence following that sentence was of a different quality than the previous ones. It was the silence of someone who just understands the argument she was building rests on ground that no longer exists. Veronica looked at me for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed registers. It was no longer the voice of deliberate control, but of something more direct, closer to what she really thought. I've been in this house for 24 years. I left my career, I managed everything. I was here when you weren't, which was most of the time. That money isn't theft, it's what I was owed and what no one ever gave me. It was the argument I'd anticipated, the argument of accumulated resentment, of years without recognition, of the abandoned career, which had never been discussed with the honesty it deserved. And what was most complicated about that argument wasn't that it was completely false. It was that it had a real root, a legitimate origin, in a dissatisfaction I hadn't addressed when I should have. But there was a difference between a grievance and a response to a grievance, and that difference was the only thing that mattered at that moment. I understand what you're saying, I answered, and parts of it I recognize as true. I worked too much. I was absent when I shouldn't have been. That's true, and I'm not going to argue it. I paused. But that's not the same as what you did. What you did has a procedure, and I've started it. I took out the last document, the copy of the divorce petition filed with the court the previous Friday with the registry stamp and date. I placed it over the others without saying anything else. Veronica looked at it. She picked it up with a hand that wasn't shaking, but moving with a slowness that wasn't her usual speed. She read the first page, then the second. When she put it down on the table, there was something on her face that was harder to look at than anger or denial. It was recognition. The moment a person understands the scenario they'd built isn't going to happen, that the calculations were wrong from the start, that the husband she thought predictable and manageable had been moving for 10 days in a direction she hadn't seen. "What did you know?" she asked. "Last week on Thursday, I confirmed the account ownership. I reviewed the statements the Wednesday before." She processed the chronology in silence. She understood in that moment that while she made the 41 unanswered calls, I already knew everything. That the silence hadn't been the reaction of a wounded man who didn't know what to say, but the calculated strategy of one who was already acting. And Marcos, she finally said, Marcos no longer has his rent paid as of this week. This afternoon, I'll send him a message. Veronica opened her mouth to say something and closed it. She tried a second time. "He's your son." "I know exactly," I answered. "That's why I also know what I gave him over these years and what he chose to do with it." He was 22 when this started. He wasn't a child. He was an adult with enough judgment to know what he was receiving and where it came from. There was no answer to that because there was no possible answer that didn't involve defending the indefensible. And Veronica was smart enough to know when an argument is exhausted. What came next wasn't a scene. That's what surprised me most about myself at that moment. The total absence of a scene. There was no yelling. There was no doors slamming. There were none of the dramatic gestures movies and TV shows have turned into the mandatory iconography of breaking marriages. There was a 40-minute conversation in low voices in the living room of a Vito lead apartment on a Sunday afternoon in November between two people who'd shared 24 years and who were unpacking the inventory of those years with the same lack of ornament with which they'd built it. Veronica asked about the house. I explained the legal position using Tomas Regueir's words, without adding or removing anything. She asked about the time frames. I gave them to her. She asked if there was room for an uncontested separation instead of the contentious process. I told her that would depend on what we agreed on in the coming days, but the documentation I had modified the basis of any agreement, so it wasn't negotiable. When we finished talking, Veronica stayed sitting on the couch with her hands on her knees, looking at the documents spread out on the low table. She wasn't crying. She had an expression that was, in its own way, more naked, that of someone making the tally of what's left after something ends. I recognized it because I'd had it too in a hotel room in Burgos, staring at the ceiling in the dark. At 4 a.m, I got up, gathered the documents, put them back in the folder in the order they were in, and went to the bedroom. That afternoon, I wrote the message to Marcos 3 sentences with no affectionate header, no insults, no long paragraph you write when you still hope to be understood. Your Madrid apartment rent payment has been canceled effective immediately. The monthly transfers too. I'm not going to answer calls or messages for a time I don't know how long will last. I sent it at 6:42 in the evening. Marcos called 16 minutes later. I didn't answer. He called 3 more times in the next hour. I didn't answer any. Not because I wanted to prolong the punishment or because I had nothing to tell him, but because what I had to tell him was already said in those 3 sentences. And any conversation at that moment would have simply been a chance for him to look for a way out I had no intention of offering him. The Argel's apartment was vacated 22 days later. The owner informed me by email with a professional neutrality I appreciated. I didn't know where Marcos went. I didn't look for him either. In the following weeks, while the legal process moved forward with the bureaucratic cadence these matters have in Spain, I dedicated myself to something I'd been putting off for a while for no specific reason. Putting my things in order, not metaphorically, but completely literally. I went to every room in that apartment with judgment and separated what was mine, what I'd brought before the marriage or acquired alone during it, from what was common or what had arrived through Veronica. It wasn't much. I'm a man with few objects of attachment: books, some photographs, work tools, clothes. In the bedroom, on the side of the bed that had been mine since 1996, there was a cardboard box at the bottom of the closet with little Marcos's things Veronica had kept with that preservation instinct mothers have for their children's objects. School drawings, some birthday photo, a ticket from a soccer game I'd taken him to when he was 9. I looked at it for a moment, closed it again. I didn't take it from where it was. It wasn't mine. What was mine was on the hallway coat rack. I took the gray coat down when the taxi taking me to the apartment I'd rented near Isabel's house was already downstairs waiting with the engine running. The suitcases were packed. The folder with the process documents was in the briefcase, the black cover notebook in the inside pocket of the jacket I was wearing in the hallway. Facing the coat rack that for 24 years had been the first and last contact with home upon entering and leaving, I grabbed it with both hands, looked at it for a second, and folded it over my arm. It was the only object I took without hesitation. Veronica, in her final weeks telling me to throw it away, that it was outdated, that it was as old as me, hadn't understood something I did understand, that the things that last aren't the ones that follow trends, but the ones made with enough solidity to survive them. The coat was 11 years old and still in perfect condition. It was the only thing in the apartment that could say the same. The Valladolid apartment I moved to was small, on a 4th floor with an elevator, an 8-minute walk from Isabel's house, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a breakfast bar, a living room window overlooking a quiet street of low houses. The first thing I did when I arrived was hang the coat on the entryway rack, which was a simple wooden bar with no further pretensions. It looked good there. That night, Isabel came over with a pot of something hot that smelled like our mother's stews and a bottle of wine that wasn't expensive, but was well chosen. We had dinner at the kitchen bar because there wasn't a table yet, talking about things without too much weight, with that specific comfort of siblings who don't need to rebuild context every time they sit together, because the context has been built for decades and requires no maintenance. Sometime during the night, Isabel asked me how I was. I told her the truth, that I wasn't well in the sense you'd want to be, but that I was in order, that there was a difference between the two things, and that difference was at that moment enough. What I learned from all this doesn't fit in a single sentence, and I distrust people who think big lessons fit in small formats. But if I had to extract something concrete, something worth saying out loud, it would be this. The mistake I made for years wasn't trusting. Trust isn't a flaw. The mistake was confusing trust with waiving verification. They're two different things. The first is necessary for any relationship to work. The second is the crack through which everything else enters. I spent 28 years auditing the numbers of companies that never would have imagined needing an audit. They all had something in common. They believed their past structure's solidity exempted them from present control. It's never like that. The accounts that don't get checked aren't the ones that are fine. They're the ones no one has looked at yet. It took me too long to apply to my own life what I knew all too well in my professional one. That's something I'll have to live with, and I accept it without drama, because the alternative, not acknowledging it, will be the kind of dishonesty I find harder to tolerate than any defeat. Marcos didn't call after the first few nights, or he called, and I let him go to voicemail without listening, which amounts to the same thing. I don't know for sure what he feels now or what version of events he's built to be able to sustain it. What I do know is that everything he has as an adult starting point, his degree, his years in Madrid, his education, I gave him during a period when he consciously and continuously chose to be part of something harming me. I can't do anything with that information other than hold it and act accordingly. Not out of anger, which left a long time ago, but from the only logic that's worked for me my whole life. Actions have results, and results are the only currency that isn't forged. The last time I saw the gray coat hanging on the rack in the apartment I shared with Veronica, she was telling me to throw it away because it was as old as me. Now it's hanging on my own coat rack in my own apartment, and there's no one to tell me anything about it. It turns out that aging well is ultimately the only form of revenge that has no cost. If you like this story, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box on the left. Thanks for watching us. We're going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day. Here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually, beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today, I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. Daddy, I almost broke my head, literally, daddy. I was moving some things, I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, daddy, and there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day. Here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today, I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. I almost broke my head, literally, daddy. I was moving some things, I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day. Here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today, I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. I almost broke my head, literally, daddy. I was moving some things, I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day. Here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today, I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. I almost broke my head, literally, daddy. I was moving some things, I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day. Here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today, I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. I almost broke my head, literally, daddy. I was moving some things. I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, Daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day, here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. Daddy, I almost broke my head, literally, Daddy. I was moving some things. I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, Daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day, here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. Daddy, I almost broke my head, literally, Daddy. I was moving some things. I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, Daddy. And there was a huge rock. Luckily, my head didn't land there, bro, but I did manage to twist my, what do you call it? My ankle. We are going over here, man. One more night here, guys, with you. Good to see you here. Applause. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. After such a tough day, man. After such a hectic day, here we are undefeated. I like this. How are we doing, bros? Good evening. Talk to me, all good? Okay. How are you, bro? Talk to me. Perlo. Perlo 420 in the house. How's it going, brother? How's everything? How's everything, my partner? What's up? What's the move, bro? Daddy, it's raining. It's raining really nicely. I think it's the last spring rain, man. No, well, spring rain, actually beginning of spring rain, bro. The truth is today I'm very, very, very good, man. Despite almost not living to tell the story today, man. I almost broke my head, literally, Daddy. I was moving some things. I fell off the truck, man. I did like a backflip, Daddy.